Let's continue this conversation with Brian Fonseca to talk more about all this. Brian, good morning. Based on what we know so far, what we're hearing from the Cuban authorities, how concerned are you by this incident? Just what was your initial reaction?
Yeah, I mean, the way that the Cuban government framed it, eventually it came out and framed it as sort of a counterterrorism, protection of territorial sovereignty, asserting that it had the right to protect itself and defend itself. Drawing it in many ways to the arguments that perhaps the U.S. has made in terms of its ability to pursue its respective interests. And so I think the Cuban government came out, and certainly I think Washington was is being calibrated in this particular context. I mean, if there were U.S. citizens involved in this, that changes the calculation in terms of how the U.S. may calibrate a response. And so I think certainly Washington is not buying the story that Cuba's put out. And so it wants to do its own due diligence before it begins to calibrate a response to Cuba. And I think certainly the idea of using or responding with the military may be difficult right now, given so much of the attention is, in fact, on Iran, as was previously mentioned. But I also think that, again, the U.S. is calibrating its response because it is working right now to apply coercion in the form of diplomatic and economic coercion to affect some form of change on the island.
Yeah, I want to ask you more. I mean, what do you make of the U.S. response? I mean, Ed mentioned some Cubans thought the U.S. would invade after this. They were surprised it was so tempered. What do you think the response could eventually be?
Yeah, I mean, I think right now the U.S. has kind of shifted military assets to other parts of the world, engaging in sort of the use of military power as an instrument of statecraft in other parts of the world. And so it's not necessarily positioned well for a full-on invasion in Cuba. But I think there's been this expectation that given the U.S. has used the military as an instrument of power in Venezuela, that Cuba would be next, and that the military might be used, and that some provocation like this, a lethal strike off the coast of Cuba, might unlock the U.S. in using the military to pursue its respective interests, which include regime change in Cuba. And so I think that, again, the calibrated response that the State Department's taking, that Secretary Rubio mentioned, I think is, again, discovery. Let's see what the facts are. If there are U.S. citizens involved in this, that changes the equation. The Cuban government is saying that these are Cuban nationals that took a U.S. boat and pursued some form of terrorist acts, or was in the process of pursuing something like that. And so that's why the Cuban government has framed it as counterterrorism. But it certainly doesn't help de-escalate the tensions between the United States and Cuba. And I think the United States for now is going to continue to rely on political and economic coercion to try to affect some form of change.
Talk to us about just the backdrop to this incident, the energy crisis Cuba is embroiled in right now because of that U.S. oil embargo. I mean, what are conditions like on the island, and just realistically, where do things stand when it comes to relations between Cuba and America?
Yeah, so, I mean, first and foremost, this is against the backdrop of course, the January 3rd military operation that captured Nicolas Maduro and brought him to the U.S. to stand trial on drug trafficking charges. You haven't seen the same kind of rhetoric against Cuba. It's largely been about democracy and repression of Cuban people. So not the same type of narrative around combating narco-terrorism, and focused on that was focused on sort of the case against Maduro. So it's slightly different. But I think there's this expectation, and even President Trump said it in his press release post the Maduro capture, that Cuba may be on the books. And so I think there's been this anticipation that the U.S. is going to somehow work to dislodge the regime in Cuba. And I think for now, what the U.S. is doing is it's enforcing the embargo. It stopped the flow of energy from Venezuela to Cuba, which was helping prop Cuba up and keep Cuba sort of the lights on in Cuba. It blocked Mexico's attempts to try to to try to ship oil to Cuba to alleviate some of the pressure. And I think this is about economic coercion. This is about enforcing the embargo that the United States has had in an effort to squeeze sort of the regime. Turn the lights off. I mean, that's the expectation, is that the lights are going to go off and that there's going to be, some demand for change. And the U.S. has to be careful, because if it's a total collapse, there could be a major, responsibility of the United States to respond with humanitarian assistance, working issues around migration.
All right. Brian Fonseca, we appreciate your expertise. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Later today, for